A white judge laughs at two black twins in court, dismissing them without a second thought. He mocks them, assumes their guilt, and doesn't even bother to hear their defense. But what he doesn't know? These two young women are not who they appear to be, because beneath the disguises they are undercover FBI agents sent to expose the deep corruption in his courtroom. And when the truth finally comes out, the entire courtroom will be shaken to its core. What happens when the judge realizes who they really are? And will justice finally be served? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily in the FBI briefing room as Maya and Liana Carter sat side by side, their attention fixed on the mountain of files spread across the table. Each manila folder told a similar story: Judge Edward Harris's pattern of harsh sentences for minorities and lenient treatment for wealthy white defendants. Maya picked up another file, her dark eyes scanning the details methodically. 3 years for a first-time shoplifting offense, she muttered, shaking her head. The defendant was a black college student. Liana grabbed a different folder, her jaw clenching. Meanwhile, this trust fund kid got community service for assault. Same week, same courtroom. She slapped the file down, making their coffee cups rattle. Special Agent Thompson, their supervisor, stood at the head of the table, his sleeves rolled up and tie loosened after hours of briefing. Judge Harris has been untouchable for years. His connections run deep, and his public image is pristine. But we finally have a chance to expose him. Why now? Maya asked, her voice steady and analytical. Thompson clicked a remote, bringing up a series of photographs on the wall screen. We've got evidence of him meeting with known corrupt officers, but it's not enough. We need him on record showing clear bias. That's where you two come in. Liana leaned forward, her eyes lighting up with determination. You want us to go undercover? Exactly, Thompson nodded. 2 college students falsely accused of armed robbery. No priors, no money for proper legal representation. Exactly the kind of defendants Harris loves to make examples of. Maya's mind was already racing through the possibilities, the risks, the angles. He'll see us as easy targets. Perfect targets, Thompson corrected. Young, black, and seemingly helpless. Everything about you will trigger his prejudices. Agent Rodriguez, their technical specialist, stepped forward with 2 thick folders. We've created complete backstories for both of you. You'll be registered at Metropolitan University, Maya as a pre-med student, Liana studying criminal justice. We've arranged for a small apartment near campus where you've supposedly been living for the past year. Maya opened her folder, studying the fabricated transcripts and financial aid documents. Everything looked authentic, down to the struggling student loan payments. How long do we have to establish our covers? 2 weeks, Thompson replied. We need you to be visible in the community, make connections, become familiar faces. The more people who can verify your presence, the more credible the case will be. Liana was already memorizing her new identity. And the arrest? How does that play out? Rodriguez pulled up a new series of images. We have 3 officers who've been under investigation for months. They're willing to play their parts, thinking they're helping Harris while actually working for us. They'll plant evidence in your apartment, cash and jewelry from a recent robbery, then they'll make a very public arrest. The twins exchanged a look, years of shared experiences and unspoken understanding passing between them. This wasn't just another assignment. This was personal. They'd seen too many lives destroyed by corrupt judges like Harris, too many families torn apart by a system that was supposed to protect them. The arrest has to look completely legitimate, Thompson continued. The officers will rough you up a bit, nothing serious, but enough to sell it. Neighbors will witness it, word will spread around campus. Harris needs to believe you're just 2 more victims he can safely railroad. Maya's voice was quiet but firm. And when exactly does he cross the line? What's our endpoint? We need him on record, Rodriguez explained, passing out more documents. Either explicitly stating his racial motivations or showing clear differential treatment that can't be explained away. The recording devices will be built into your clothing, completely undetectable. Your initial hearing will be in his courtroom, Thompson added. That's when the real work begins. We'll have backup plans in place. but this operation hinges on your ability to draw out his true nature. The next hour was spent reviewing protocols, emergency procedures, and communication methods. The sisters absorbed every detail, asking pointed questions and suggesting refinements to the plan. Finally, as the briefing wound down, Thompson looked at them seriously. "This is completely voluntary. Once it starts, you'll be largely on your own. We can pull you out if things get dangerous, but that means losing our shot at Harris. Are you both sure about this?" Liana's response was immediate. "We've been waiting for an opportunity like this our whole careers." Maya nodded, her expression resolute. "Someone needs to stop him. Might as well be us." The next 2 weeks passed in a carefully choreographed dance. The sisters moved into their modest apartment, attended classes, and built their covers piece by piece. They made friends with classmates, complained about professors, and struggled visibly with part-time jobs, all while the FBI team monitored their progress and fine-tuned the operation. Then came the day of the arrest. Maya and Liana were in their apartment, deliberately playing music loud enough for neighbors to hear, when the door burst open. 3 officers stormed in, weapons drawn, shouting orders. "Police, hands where we can see them!" The sisters played their parts perfectly, showing confusion and fear as they were forced to the ground. The officers made a show of discovering the planted evidence, making sure their body cameras captured every moment. "Well, well," one officer sneered, holding up a bag of jewelry. "Look what we have here." Neighbors peeked out their doors, recording with their phones as the twins were roughly handcuffed and led out of the building. Maya stumbled slightly as she was pushed down the stairs, earning a sharp laugh from one of the officers. The police car waited in the parking lot, its lights flashing brightly in the evening darkness. The sisters were shoved into the back seat, the metal handcuffs biting into their wrists. As they pulled away from the curb, the officer in the passenger seat turned to look at them with a smirk. "You two are so done," he said, clearly enjoying his role. Liana caught Maya's eyes in the window's reflection. Neither spoke, but both felt the weight of the moment. Their real work was just beginning. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the dingy walls. Maya and Liana were roughly separated, each sister being dragged down different corridors to separate interrogation rooms. The metal chairs scraped against the concrete floor as they were pushed into their seats. In room A, Maya sat perfectly still, her training kicking in as she observed every detail. The one-way mirror reflected her composed expression, though her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. 2 officers entered, one tall and intimidating, the other wearing a practiced, friendly smile. "Look," the friendly one said, pulling up a chair. "You seem like a smart girl. Pre-med student, right? Good grades, bright future. Why throw it all away?" Maya remained silent, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The other officer slammed his hands on the table, making the metal rattle. "Your fingerprints are all over the weapon. We've got witnesses. Stop wasting our time." In room B, Liana faced similar tactics. A heavy-set officer loomed over her, his coffee breath hot on her face as he leaned in close. "You people never learn, do you?" he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Always thinking you can get away with it." Liana's fingers dug into her palms under the table, but she kept her expression neutral. Another officer sat in the corner, flipping through a file with exaggerated interest. "Armed robbery carries a hefty sentence," the seated officer commented, "especially with Judge Harris presiding. He doesn't take kindly to this sort of thing." Back in room A, the interrogation continued. The friendly officer slid a paper across the table toward Maya. "Here's the deal. Sign this confession, take the plea, and we can work something out. Maybe get you into a minimum security facility." Maya's voice was steady as she spoke for the first time. "I want a lawyer." The intimidating officer's face darkened. "A lawyer? You think some public defender is going to help you? You're looking at 15 years minimum. No lawyer is saving you." In room B, Liana watched as the officers grew increasingly frustrated with her silence. One of them paced the room, his boots echoing off the walls. "We found the jewelry in your apartment," he snapped. "The weapon has your prints. We've got security footage. Make it easier on yourself." Liana's response matched her sister's. "I want a lawyer." The officer in the corner threw down his file. "Listen here," he growled, dropping all pretense of professionalism. "Your kind doesn't do well in prison. Take the deal while it's on the table." Unknown to the officers, every word was being recorded by the FBI's surveillance equipment. In a van parked 2 blocks away, Agent Thompson and his team monitored the feeds, documenting every slur, every threat, every violation of procedure. "They're following the pattern perfectly," Thompson muttered, making notes. "Classic Harris setup. Pressure them into a plea before they can mount a defense." On his screen, he watched as one of the corrupt officers made a phone call from his desk. The conversation was brief but telling. "Yeah, Judge Harris? Got 2 for you. College students, armed robbery. Yeah, exactly what you're thinking. No priors, but the evidence is solid." He laughed. "Tomorrow morning? Perfect. They won't know what hit them." The sisters were eventually moved from interrogation to processing. Their fingerprints were taken, mugshots snapped, and personal belongings cataloged. The orange jumpsuits felt rough against their skin as they changed under the watchful eye of a female officer. "Shame," the officer commented, checking Maya's pockets. "You two could have made something of yourselves." The holding cell was small and cold, with a single metal bench bolted to the wall. The sisters sat side by side, their shoulders touching, the first contact they'd had since their arrest hours ago. Liana leaned her head against the cold metal bars, letting out a slow, controlled breath. The weight of their situation, even though it was planned, felt oppressively real. Maya glanced around, ensuring no officers were within earshot before whispering, "We knew this was coming. Stick to the plan." Through the bars, they could see one of the officers at his desk, phone pressed to his ear. His laughter echoed down the corridor. "Judge Harris is gonna love this one." The night stretched on, neither sister sleeping as they sat in their cell. They could hear other inmates in nearby cells, some crying, others shouting, a few praying. The reality of what happened to people in their situation, people without the protection of an FBI operation behind them, weighed heavily on their minds. Officers passed by periodically, some ignoring them completely, others making small comments clearly meant to intimidate. "Harris has a special touch with cases like yours," one sneered during his rounds. "Real special touch." The sisters remained silent, but their presence was powerful. Even in orange jumpsuits, they maintained their dignity, their composure a stark contrast to the chaos around them. It was this very strength, they knew, that would make Judge Harris want to break them. In the FBI van, Thompson's team continued their surveillance. Every passing hour brought more evidence of the systemic corruption they were fighting. Officers fabricated details in their reports, making multiple calls to Judge Harris's office to ensure the expedited hearing. "Harris is already preparing his statement," Rodriguez reported, listening through the wiretap. "He's planning to make an example of them." Thompson nodded grimly. "That's exactly what we need. Let him think he's got 2 more victims. Let him think he's untouchable." Back in the holding cell, the first light of dawn began to creep through the high windows. Maya and Liana sat exactly as they had all night, their backs straight, their expressions composed. They had watched the system destroy too many lives to back down now. Every insult, every threat, every violation of their rights only strengthened their resolve. The heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 237 creaked open as Maya and Liana were led inside. Their shackles clinked with each step, a metallic rhythm that echoed through the packed gallery. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet and illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to the injustice about to unfold. Judge Edward Harris sat elevated at his bench, a commanding presence in his black robes. His silver hair caught the light as he adjusted his collar, barely glancing at the twins as they were guided to the defense table. His thin lips curved into a slight smirk as he leaned forward to the microphone, the gold signet ring on his right hand glinting as he arranged his papers with practiced precision. Well, look what we have here," Harris drawled, his voice carrying an edge of amusement that didn't reach his cold eyes. A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom, the sound bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. The regular spectators knew the routine. These proceedings were mere theater, with Harris as the director who had already written the ending, casting himself as both judge and executioner of dreams. The bailiff stepped forward, his uniform pressed to perfection. All rise. The Honorable Judge Edward Harris presiding in the matter of the state versus Maya and Liana Carter. The sisters remained perfectly still as the charges were read, their faces masks of calm despite the storm brewing inside. Armed robbery, possession of stolen property, resisting arrest. Each charge hung in the air like a weight, met with knowing nods from the gallery and whispered comments behind cupped hands. The prosecution, a young attorney in an expensive suit that screamed privilege, approached the bench with an air of casual confidence that came from knowing the game was rigged in his favor. "Your Honor, the evidence in this case is overwhelming." He began laying out photographs and documents, each one carefully fabricated by the corrupt officers who'd been in Harris's pocket for years. "We have fingerprints on the weapon, security footage, and witnesses who can place the defendants at the scene of the crime." Harris nodded along, barely examining the evidence presented, his fingers drumming lightly on the bench. His attention seemed more focused on adjusting his gold cufflinks than the actual proceedings that would determine 2 young lives. The public defender assigned to the twins, a tired-looking woman with shadows under her eyes and a stuffed briefcase that had seen better days, stood up with a sigh that spoke of countless battles lost in this very room. "Your Honor, if I may, the evidence presented is circumstantial at best. The fingerprint analysis was rushed, the security footage is unclear, and—" "Save it," Harris interrupted, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away an annoying fly. "I know how this ends." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, his eyes finally settling on Maya and Liana with open disdain that he didn't bother to disguise. "Tell me, ladies, you claim to be college students?" His tone dripped with skepticism. Maya straightened her spine, dignity radiating from her despite the orange jumpsuit. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm pre-med, and my sister—" "Pre-med?" Harris chuckled, encouraging more laughter from the gallery with a knowing glance. "And I suppose you're paying for that with honest work? Or are you just hustling your way through life like so many others from your background?" The courtroom erupted in laughter again, the sound cruel and cutting. Maya's fists clenched under the table, her knuckles turning white with suppressed anger that threatened to boil over. Beside her, Liana delivered a subtle kick to her ankle, their prearranged signal to maintain composure in the face of blatant prejudice. From the back of the courtroom, a well-dressed man in wire-rimmed glasses observed intently, his face a careful blank. The FBI plant posing as their real defense attorney took careful notes in a leather-bound notebook, his presence unknown to everyone except the twins and the surveillance team, monitoring every biased word. "Your Honor," the public defender tried again, her voice stronger this time. "My clients have no prior records. They're honor students with community service backgrounds and—" "With a taste for armed robbery, apparently," Harris cut in, not even attempting to hide his contempt. "Let's not waste time with these fairy tales about academic achievement." He shuffled some papers on his bench, clearly ready to wrap up the proceedings that were nothing more than a formality in his courtroom. The prosecutor smiled, sharing a knowing look with Harris that spoke of lunches shared and favors exchanged. "The state requests an expedited trial date, Your Honor, given the serious nature of the charges." "Agreed." Harris nodded, not bothering to consult his actual calendar. "Let's set this for—" He made a show of checking his schedule, though everyone knew the decision was already made. "Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp." "Monday?" the public defender protested, her voice rising with genuine alarm. "Your Honor, that's only 3 days away. We need time to prepare a proper defense, review the evidence, interview witnesses." 3 days is plenty of time for a case this straightforward, Harris declared with finality, cutting through her objections like a knife. His eyes swept over Maya and Liana with barely concealed contempt, lingering a moment too long. "Don't worry, I won't waste too much time on this nonsense." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. The sound hung in the air, final and decisive, sealing the trap that Harris had unwittingly walked into with his own prejudice as the bait. Maya and Liana remained composed as they were led away, their shackles once again providing a rhythmic accompaniment to their exit. Their faces revealed nothing, but their eyes met briefly, a silent promise that justice would eventually be served, just not in the way Harris expected. Behind them, Harris continued shuffling papers, already moving on to his next case, completely unaware that every word, every prejudiced comment, every violation of due process had been carefully documented and would soon return to haunt him. The gallery began to clear out, the regular spectators chatting among themselves about the brief but entertaining show they'd witnessed, oblivious to the real drama unfolding beneath the surface. The prosecutor packed up his fabricated evidence, sharing another knowing smile with Harris. The exhausted public defender shoved papers into her overflowing briefcase, shoulders slumped in defeat that had become all too familiar. From his position in the back, the FBI plant closed his notebook and quietly slipped out, his wire having captured every damning moment of Harris's performance. The trap was set, and the judge had played his part perfectly, reading from a script of his own prejudice that would ultimately lead to his downfall. In a dimly lit room filled with surveillance equipment, FBI agents huddled around multiple screens displaying live footage from Judge Harris's courtroom. The safe house, located in an unremarkable suburban house, buzzed with focused energy as operators monitored various feeds and recorded every moment of the operation. The air smelled faintly of coffee and electronics, with the soft hum of cooling fans providing a constant background noise. Lead Agent Thompson, a veteran with salt and pepper hair, leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on the main screen. His fingers drummed against the metal desk as he watched Harris dismiss yet another legitimate defense motion without even pretending to consider it. The lines around Thompson's eyes deepened with each dismissal. "We've got him on record already," Thompson said, shaking his head. "But we need more. We need undeniable proof he's tampering with cases." He turned to face his team, each member carefully selected for this sensitive operation. The determination in his eyes was unmistakable. Time to move to Phase 2. Agent Chen, the technical specialist, pulled up a series of documents on her screen. Her quick, efficient movements betrayed years of experience in surveillance operations. "Everything's in place. The defense attorney has the motion ready and the body cam footage is secured." She typed rapidly, ensuring all recording devices were functioning perfectly. The reflection of code flickered across her glasses. "If Harris reacts the way we expect, we'll have him cornered." Thompson nodded, his expression grim. "He's gotten away with this for too long. Let's see how he handles actual resistance." He rubbed his tired eyes, knowing they were close to a breakthrough. The next morning, the courtroom hummed with its usual activity. Harris sat at his bench, looking down at the proceedings with his characteristic air of superiority. His polished appearance and confident demeanor masked the prejudice that guided his decisions. Maya and Liana sat at the defense table, their expressions carefully neutral despite the tension in the air. Their hands rested calmly on the table, betraying none of the anticipation they felt inside. Their FBI-planted defense attorney, James Morrison, rose from his chair. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the light as he approached the bench, carrying a thick manila folder. The regular courthouse observers straightened in their seats, surprised by this departure from the usual script. A few whispers circulated through the gallery. "Your Honor," Morrison began, his voice clear and confident, "I'd like to submit a motion to obtain the police body cam footage from the night of my client's arrest." He held up the formal request, the papers crisp and official. His stance was respectful but unyielding. The change in Harris's demeanor was subtle but noticeable. His fingers tightened slightly on his gavel, and his eyes flickered with momentary uncertainty. The camera mounted discreetly in the courtroom caught every micro-expression as the judge processed this unexpected challenge. A muscle in his jaw twitched almost imperceptibly. Harris quickly composed himself, but not before the surveillance team had captured his telltale reaction. "Denied?" he scoffed, trying to maintain his usual dismissive tone. "This case is open and shut. We don't need to waste the court's time with unnecessary evidence." He waved his hand as if swatting away an annoying fly. Morrison pressed on exactly as planned. "Your Honor, the defendants have a right to review all evidence pertaining to their arrest, The body cam footage is crucial to establishing. I said denied, Harris snapped, his voice sharper now. A hint of color rose in his normally composed face. This court has already reviewed sufficient evidence to proceed. Unless you have something relevant to present, counselor, we're done here. The gavel came down with more force than necessary. In the back of the courtroom, Marcus Wheeler, a former court clerk who had worked under Harris for 5 years, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been watching the proceedings with growing anxiety, his collar feeling tighter with each passing moment. Beads of sweat formed at his hairline despite the cool temperature of the room. Wheeler had been approached by FBI agents 3 months earlier. They had evidence of his involvement in Harris's scheme, doctored documents, manipulated evidence logs, case files that mysteriously disappeared. In exchange for immunity, he had agreed to cooperate, but watching Maya and Liana actually challenge Harris made everything feel more real and dangerous. His stomach churned with each exchange. As the court session ended, Wheeler hurried out of the building, his hands shaking as he loosened his tie. The setting sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as he rushed to his car, constantly looking over his shoulder. His keys jangled nervously in his trembling fingers. Once inside his modest apartment, Wheeler paced the living room, wearing a path in the carpet. The FBI had installed surveillance equipment weeks ago, capturing every movement and sound as the former clerk finally broke under the pressure. The ticking of his wall clock seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. At exactly 9:47 p.m., Wheeler grabbed his burner phone, the one he thought was secure, and dialed a number he knew by heart. In the FBI safe house, agents leaned forward as the call connected, headphones pressed to their ears. "The girls are fighting back," Wheeler whispered urgently into the phone, his voice trembling. Harris wasn't expecting this. If they push for the footage, this could go sideways fast. He ran his fingers through his thinning hair, pacing faster now. The FBI surveillance team exchanged satisfied looks as they recorded every word. Agent Thompson smiled, recognizing the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. Bingo. He made a fist in silent celebration. In another part of the safe house, Maya and Liana sat reviewing transcripts from the day's proceedings. They had changed out of their prison jumpsuits and into casual clothes, but their posture remained alert and focused. Empty takeout containers sat forgotten on a side table. "Harris's mask slipped today," Maya observed, highlighting another instance of obvious bias in the transcript. Her analytical mind cataloged each piece of evidence methodically. Liana nodded, her expression determined. "Did you see his face when Morrison mentioned the body cam footage?" He looked scared for a second there. A hint of satisfaction colored her words as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Agent Marcus Rowe entered their room, holding a tablet displaying Wheeler's ongoing phone conversation. "Ladies, you're doing excellent work. Wheeler just made the call we've been waiting for. He's panicking, which means Harris will be too." His experienced eyes held a mixture of pride and caution. The twins shared a look of satisfaction. Their time in the holding cells, the humiliation in court, the racist comments they'd endured. It was all worth it to finally have concrete evidence of Harris's corruption. The justice they had fought so hard for was finally within reach. Through the surveillance speakers, Wheeler's anxious voice continued to provide exactly what the FBI needed. Each word he spoke added another nail to Harris's coffin, though the judge didn't know it yet. The trap wasn't just set anymore. It was starting to close, slowly but inevitably, like the final pages of a book where justice prevails against all odds. Meanwhile, Judge Edward Harris sat in his dimly lit office, the leather chair creaking as he leaned back and poured himself a generous measure of bourbon. The crystal decanter clinked against the glass, his usually steady hands betraying a slight tremor. Scattered across his mahogany desk were papers from the Carter twins' case, each document a potential landmine in what should have been a routine conviction. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds, creating prison bar patterns across his face. Harris took a long sip, savoring the burn of alcohol while glaring at the motion for body cam footage. These girls weren't following the usual script. They were supposed to take the plea deal, like all the others before them. The sharp ring of his phone cut through the silence, making him flinch. The caller ID showed District Attorney Peterson's number. Harris pressed the speaker button, not bothering with pleasantries. "They're asking for body cam footage." Peterson's voice crackled through, tense and urgent. "We need to make sure it doesn't exist." Harris's jaw clenched as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Years of carefully orchestrated cases, perfectly maintained appearances, all threatened by two college students who didn't know their place. He exhaled sharply, his voice low and controlled despite his rising anger. "Leave it to me," he responded, ending the call with a decisive click. The judge stood up, walking to his office window. Below, the courthouse steps were empty except for a few pigeons pecking at scattered crumbs. He'd built his career on keeping certain people in their place, maintaining what he called order in his courtroom. Now these twins thought they could challenge his authority. In the county jail's holding cell, Maya and Liana sat cross-legged on their separate bunks, their orange jumpsuits bright against the dull gray walls. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they spoke in hushed tones, careful to avoid drawing attention from the guards. "Harris took the bait," Maya whispered, leaning forward slightly. "Did you see how his left eye twitched when Morrison mentioned the footage?" Liana nodded, absently braiding and unbraiding a small section of her hair. "He's scared. Men like him always are when they're about to lose control." She glanced at the cell door before continuing. "The FBI said this would push him to act. Now we wait." Maya's fingers traced invisible patterns on her knee as she considered their next move. "The footage request will force his hand. He'll have to either produce it or make it disappear," Liana finished, a slight smile playing at her lips. "And we both know which option he'll choose." In the FBI's mobile command center, parked inconspicuously 3 blocks from the courthouse, agents monitored multiple screens showing surveillance feeds from various locations. Agent Thompson adjusted his headset as he watched Sergeant Mike Reynolds, a known associate of Judge Harris, enter the police station's main office. Reynolds' face was flushed with anger as he cornered Officer Jenkins, a young cop known for his willingness to follow orders without question. The surveillance microphones picked up their conversation clearly. "Those body cam files?" Reynolds growled, jabbing a finger at Jenkins's chest. "They need to disappear. Tonight. Permanently. Understand?" Jenkins nodded quickly, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "Yes, sir. I'll take care of it." The FBI team watched as Jenkins waited until the night shift began, when the station was nearly empty. He made his way to the evidence room, swiping his access card with trembling hands. The hidden cameras the FBI had installed weeks ago captured every movement as he logged into the system. Jenkins's fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating to the folder containing the arrest footage. He hesitated for just a moment before pressing delete, watching as the progress bar filled, erasing what he thought was the only copy of the damning evidence. The officer wiped his sweaty palms on his uniform pants, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face as he stood up. "Done," he muttered to himself, completely unaware of the multiple cameras recording his every move. In the FBI command center, the team watched the deletion in real time. Agent Thompson leaned forward in his chair, a knowing smile crossing his weathered features. "Perfect," he said, turning to face his team. "We've got them obstructing justice on camera." Chen pulled up another screen showing the secured copies of the body cam footage they'd retrieved days ago, safely stored on multiple encrypted servers. "They really thought we'd leave the only copy in their system," she said, shaking her head. "Now," Thompson said, his eyes fixed on the monitor showing Jenkins leaving the evidence room, "let's see how Harris reacts in court." The weight of their success hung in the air as the FBI team continued their surveillance, knowing they had just captured indisputable evidence of corruption. The carefully laid trap had worked exactly as planned, catching not just a corrupt officer but creating a direct link back to Judge Harris himself. In their holding cell, unaware of the night's developments but confident in the plan, Maya and Liana prepared for sleep. The sisters exchanged knowing looks as the lights dimmed for the night, their faith in justice stronger than ever. They had endured Harris's courtroom theatrics, his thinly veiled racism, and his attempts to rush their case through the system. Now, with the FBI's careful orchestration, they were finally seeing their mission bear fruit. The next day, the morning sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floor. Judge Harris strode into the courtroom, his black robes billowing slightly with each confident step. His earlier anxiety had been replaced by a familiar smugness. His shoulders relaxed, and his chin lifted high. The gallery quieted as he took his seat, adjusting his reading glasses with practiced precision. Maya and Liana sat at the defense table, their orange jumpsuits stark against the dark wood furniture. They maintained perfect posture, their expressions carefully neutral as they watched Harris settle into his throne-like chair. Their attorney, James Morrison, stood beside them, a plain manila folder resting on the table in front of him. "Your Honor," Morrison began, his voice clear and steady, "the defense would like to formally request the body cam footage from the night of my client's arrest." Harris's lips curved into a condescending smile. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a small chuckle that echoed through the hushed courtroom. "Unfortunately, it seems the footage has been lost." He spread his hands in a gesture of mock helplessness. "Tragic, really. Technical difficulties, I'm told." A wave of whispers rippled through the gallery. Several spectators exchanged knowing looks, while others shook their heads in disgust. An elderly woman in the front row muttered, "Of course it has, just loud enough to be heard." Maya's fingers twitched slightly under the table, but her face remained impassive. Beside her, Liana sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Harris's face, as if memorizing every detail of this moment. Morrison nodded slowly, appearing completely unfazed by the judge's announcement. "I see," he said, reaching for the manila folder. "In that case, Your Honor, I'd like to submit this into evidence." He withdrew a thick stack of papers, walking forward to present them to the bench. Harris's brow furrowed as he accepted the document. "What exactly am I looking at, Counselor?" "That would be a complete transcript of the deleted footage, Your Honor." Morrison's voice remained professionally neutral as he returned to the defense table and opened his laptop. "And if it pleases the court, I have the actual video right here." Before Harris could object, Morrison had connected his laptop to the courtroom's display system. The large screen on the wall flickered to life, showing crystal-clear footage from the night of the arrest. The timestamp in the corner matched the police report exactly. The courtroom fell silent as they watched officers methodically planting evidence in Maya and Liana's apartment. The footage showed them carefully placing stolen items in backpacks, laughing as they staged the scene. The audio picked up one officer saying, "Harris is gonna love these two." Harris's knuckles whitened around his gavel as the video continued. His previous smugness had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. The footage then transitioned to a grainy night vision recording of Officer Jenkins in the evidence room, systematically deleting what he thought were the only copies of the body cam footage. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom. One juror covered her mouth in shock, while another scribbled furiously in his notepad. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, loosening his tie with one finger. "This proves nothing," Harris snapped, his voice rising sharply. He slammed his gavel down, the crack echoing through the chamber. "Even if it were true, it doesn't change the facts of this case." Maya tilted her head slightly, studying the judge's face with the careful attention of someone who had spent years analyzing human behavior. She noted the slight tremor in his left hand, the way his right eye twitched when he spoke, the beads of sweat forming at his hairline. Liana observed too, her trained eye catching the subtle signs of a man unraveling. The judge's fingers drummed an erratic pattern on his desk, his breathing had become shallow, and his usual commanding presence had diminished significantly. "Your Honor," Morrison began again, but Harris cut him off with another sharp crack of his gavel. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," Harris announced, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his water glass in his haste to leave the bench. The judge practically fled from the courtroom, his robes fluttering behind him as he rushed down the private corridor to his chambers. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the framed law degree on his wall. Inside, Harris's carefully maintained composure crumbled completely. His hands shook as he fumbled with his phone, missing the keypad twice before successfully dialing. He paced behind his desk, running his free hand through his gray hair repeatedly as he waited for an answer. His breathing came in short, sharp bursts. "We have a problem," he said into the phone, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. The words echoed slightly in his office, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls and leather-bound law books that had once represented his unshakable authority. What Harris didn't know was that in a nearby surveillance van, FBI technicians were already recording every word, every nervous breath, every admission of guilt that was about to spill from his lips. The trap had sprung perfectly, and the judge was about to hang himself with his own words. Sometime later, in the dimly lit confines of an FBI safe house, a team of agents huddled around sophisticated surveillance equipment, their faces illuminated by the soft blue glow of multiple monitors. The room hummed with tension as they listened to Judge Harris's panicked phone call through crystal-clear audio feeds. "If those girls walk free, they'll open the floodgates," Harris muttered, his voice trembling with barely contained fear. The agents exchanged knowing glances as they heard him pace back and forth in his chambers. "We need to shut this down." A calm, calculated voice responded through the line, its tone eerily composed despite the situation. "You're panicking. Handle this like you always do." Lead Agent Thompson leaned forward, adjusting his headphones while making notes on a legal pad. Behind him, other agents worked silently, documenting every word and nuance of the conversation. The evidence was mounting by the minute, each recorded word another nail in Harris's coffin. Across town in the county jail, Maya and Liana were being escorted back to their holding cell. Their footsteps echoed through the concrete corridor, accompanied by the rhythmic jingling of their chains. The guard behind them, Officer Reynolds, maintained a tight grip on their arms, his fingers digging in harder than necessary. As they approached the cell, Reynolds's facade of authority cracked slightly. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door, clearly rattled by what he'd witnessed in the courtroom. He shoved them inside with unnecessary force, trying to mask his nervousness with aggression. "You two don't know who you're messing with," he muttered through clenched teeth, his voice low enough that only the sisters could hear. Maya and Liana exchanged a meaningful glance but remained silent as the cell door clanged shut. They had been prepared for this kind of intimidation, knew it was just another sign that their plan was working. The guards' fear only confirmed what they already knew. The corrupt system was beginning to crack. In a quiet coffee shop across town, FBI agent Sarah Chen sat across from James Wilson, the former court clerk. The establishment was nearly empty, perfect for their clandestine meeting. Wilson's hands shook as he lifted his coffee cup, spilling a few drops onto the worn wooden table. "If I talk, I'm done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted nervously around the room, checking every corner, every shadow. Years of working under Harris had taught him to always look over his shoulder. Agent Chen maintained a calm demeanor as she reached into her briefcase. She withdrew a document and slid it across the table with practiced precision. The paper contained official FBI letterhead and detailed protection agreements. "We'll protect you," she assured him, her voice firm but compassionate. "But you need to tell the truth." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "Everything you know about Harris, every case he's manipulated, every deal he's made, we need it all." Wilson stared at the document, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical force. He had watched Harris destroy countless lives over the years, had been complicit in the judge's systematic discrimination. Now he had the chance to make it right, but the cost would be enormous. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Harris stood at the window, gripping a silver flask in his trembling hand. The city light sparkled beyond the glass, a stark contrast to the darkness he felt closing in around him. His reflection stared back at him, a man he barely recognized anymore. The confident, powerful judge was gone, replaced by someone desperate and afraid. The flask shook as he lifted it to his lips, taking another long drink. The expensive bourbon did nothing to calm his nerves. His entire world was unraveling, and for the first time in his career, he couldn't see a way out. His phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. The sound made him jump, splashing bourbon onto his desk. The number was unfamiliar, but he knew he had to answer. His hand shook as he picked up the receiver. "Judge," a cold voice said without preamble. The speaker's tone sent chills down Harris's spine. This wasn't one of his usual contacts. This was someone higher up, someone who usually remained in the shadows. "Do we need to make them disappear?" the voice asked, each word precise and measured, devoid of emotion. Harris gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. He knew what they were offering, a permanent solution to his problem. It wouldn't be the first time such measures had been taken, but something felt different this time. He stared at his reflection again, seeing the moral crossroads clearly in his own haunted eyes. The twins' faces flashed through his mind, their quiet dignity in the courtroom, their unwavering determination. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. "No," he whispered into the phone, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat and repeated more firmly, "No. Not yet." The silence that followed his response was heavy with implication. Harris could feel the disapproval radiating through the phone line, could almost see the speaker's cold smile. He knew this answer wouldn't satisfy them for long, but he needed time to think, to plan, to find another way out of this mess. Days later, the morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Judge Harris sat at his bench, his usual commanding presence diminished by the visible tension in his shoulders, his fingers wrapped tightly around his gavel, knuckles white with strain. Every few seconds, his eyes darted toward the gallery where Maya and Liana sat, their expressions calm and measured. The twins maintained perfect composure, but they noticed every detail of Harris's deteriorating facade. The slight tremor in his hand as he shuffled papers, the way his collar seemed too tight, making him tug at it repeatedly, the sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the courtroom. Harris cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the hushed chamber. "Let's proceed," he announced, his voice lacking its usual authority. He glanced at the defense table, expecting another blow to his carefully constructed world. In the back of the courtroom, FBI agents sat strategically placed among the spectators, their presence unknown to most. They had spent the night analyzing Harris's desperate phone calls, preparing for this moment. Agent Thompson adjusted his tie, a subtle signal to Maya and Liana's lawyer that everything was in place. The defense attorney rose slowly, his movements deliberate. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit new evidence for consideration." He approached the bench with a manila envelope, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Harris's face twitched slightly. "What kind of evidence?" he asked, unable to completely mask the tremor in his voice. "Audio recordings, Your Honor, obtained through legal wiretaps with full federal authorization." The color drained from Harris's face as the attorney set up a small speaker system. The prosecutor shifted in his chair, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The courtroom held its collective breath. The first recording crackled to life, Harris's voice filling the chamber. "They need to be put away before this gets out of hand." The judge sat perfectly still, his expression frozen as his own words echoed back at him. A second voice, unknown and cold, responded through the speaker. "If they push too hard, we handle it another way." Harris's recorded voice returned, desperate and calculating. "I just need time to discredit them." Maya watched Harris intently as the recordings played, noting how his composed facade cracked with each damning word. His hands lay flat on the bench now, as if he was trying to anchor himself to something solid. The prosecutor beside him had begun to edge away slightly, creating physical distance from the man he'd so eagerly supported just days before. The defense attorney paused the recordings. "We have more, Your Honor, but first, we'd like to call a witness." He turned toward the gallery. "The defense calls James Wilson." The former court clerk rose from his seat, his legs visibly shaking as he made his way to the witness stand. His eyes never met Harris's gaze as he was sworn in. The man looked smaller somehow, crushed under the weight of the secrets he'd carried for so long. "Mr. Wilson," the attorney began gently, "how long did you work as Judge Harris's clerk?" 12 years, Wilson replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The microphone carried his words across the silent courtroom. "And during that time, what instructions did Judge Harris give you regarding case records?" Wilson swallowed hard, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He told me to alter them. The records, I mean, especially for sentencing. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Harris's jaw clenched visibly. "Could you be more specific?" the attorney pressed. Wilson's voice shook as he continued. He wanted to make sure black defendants got longer sentences. He'd tell me to adjust the numbers, make them look higher. The clerk's eyes filled with tears. He said no one would notice, that we were doing society a favor. Harris's fists clenched on the bench, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The prosecutor beside him had begun gathering his papers, clearly preparing to distance himself from the impending fallout. Did Judge Harris ever express concern about these alterations being discovered? He said the system would protect itself, Wilson replied, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, that everyone who mattered understood what we were doing. The gallery erupted in shocked whispers. Harris sat motionless, watching his carefully constructed world crumble around him. Years of manipulation and prejudice, exposed in mere minutes. His attorney leaned in close, whispering urgently in his ear. The judge's face remained stone-like as he listened, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. Harris cleared his throat and grabbed his gavel. The sound of it striking the bench cut through the chaos like a gunshot. "We're adjourning until further notice," he announced, his voice strained but controlled. He stood quickly, his robe swishing as he turned to leave. But Maya caught it, the trembling in his hands as he gathered his papers, the slight stumble in his step as he headed for his chambers. The mask of authority had cracked completely, revealing the desperate man beneath. In the back of the courtroom, an FBI agent turned to his partner, keeping his voice low. "He knows he's done. He just doesn't know when it's coming." Meanwhile, the heavy oak door slammed behind Judge Harris as he stormed into his chambers, the sound echoing through the room like a thunderclap. His usually immaculate silver hair was disheveled, and dark patches of sweat had formed under his arms, seeping through his expensive suit jacket. Behind him, his lawyer, Richard Bennett, followed closely, his face etched with concern. "Edward, you need to listen to me," Bennett whispered urgently, closing the door behind them. "This isn't like the other times. They've got too much. The recordings, the footage, the witness. This isn't going away." Harris paced across the Persian rug, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor where they stepped beyond its edges. He grabbed his handkerchief and wiped the perspiration from his forehead, his hands noticeably unsteady. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows seemed to mock the darkness of his situation. "Then we shut it down," Harris muttered, his voice hoarse with barely contained rage. He threw the damp handkerchief onto his mahogany desk, scattering several legal briefs. "We've handled worse before." In the holding cell across the courthouse, Maya and Liana sat on the cold metal bench, their orange jumpsuits bright against the gray concrete walls. Despite their circumstances, a subtle air of confidence surrounded them. They could feel the shift in power like a changing tide. "He's starting to crack," Liana whispered, leaning close to her sister. "Did you see his face when the recordings played?" Maya nodded, her eyes focused on the cell door. "But we can't celebrate yet. He's cornered, and that makes him dangerous." She lowered her voice even further. "We need him to make one more mistake. One big one." Back in his chambers, Harris yanked his phone from its cradle, his fingers trembling as he dialed a familiar number. The first call went to voicemail. So did the second. On the third try, someone finally answered. "What is it, Edward?" The voice belonged to Commissioner Williams, usually a reliable ally in Harris's network of corruption. "James, I need your help. This case, these girls, it needs to go away. Now." Harris's voice cracked slightly, betraying his desperation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I saw the news, Edward. The recordings are already circulating." "Damn it, James, we've handled worse. Remember the Martinez case, the Thompson investigation?" Harris's voice rose, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "This is different," Williams replied, his tone distant. "The FBI is involved. There's too much evidence, too many eyes watching. We can't protect you from this." Harris slammed his fist on the desk. "Can't or won't?" Both. Williams's voice hardened. You need to start thinking about your exit strategy. We're done here. The line went dead. Harris stared at the phone in disbelief before dropping it back into its cradle. His hands were shaking more violently now. He tried another number, then another. Each call ended the same way, with former allies distancing themselves, refusing to help, suggesting he find a way out. Bennett watched from near the door, his expression grim. Edward, we need to discuss plea options. Plea options? Harris spat the words out like poison. I'm a judge, for God's sake. I don't take pleas. You're a judge who's been caught on tape discussing how to suppress evidence and intimidate defendants, Bennett replied firmly. A judge with a documented history of racial bias in sentencing. The FBI has everything, Edward. Everything. Harris stumbled to his leather chair and sank into it, the fight suddenly draining from his body. His hands trembled as he reached for the crystal decanter on his desk, but he couldn't steady them enough to pour a drink. The glass clinked against the crystal as he tried and failed. The reality of his situation began to sink in, settling over him like a heavy shroud. For decades, he had operated with impunity, protected by a network of powerful friends and corrupt officials. He had ruined lives with the bang of his gavel, secure in the knowledge that no one could touch him. But now, those same allies were abandoning him. The system he had manipulated for so long was turning against him. And it had all started with those two girls, those defendants he had mocked openly in his courtroom, assuming they were just two more powerless victims for his twisted version of justice. Harris slumped forward, resting his forehead in his trembling hands. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, particles of his crumbling empire made visible in the harsh light of day. For the first time in his career, Judge Edward Harris felt truly powerless. No one was coming to save him. No backroom deals would make this disappear. The carefully constructed facade of respectability he had maintained for decades was shattering, revealing the ugly truth beneath. And the most bitter pill to swallow was the knowledge that his downfall had been orchestrated by the very people he had underestimated. Two young black women he had dismissed as insignificant, treating them with the same casual cruelty he had shown countless others before them. Now they were systematically dismantling everything he had built, exposing every dark secret, every abuse of power, every act of prejudice he had hidden behind his judge's robes. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The darkness of the holding cell was broken only by thin strips of fluorescent light seeping through the small window in the door. Maya lay on the hard metal bunk, her mind racing through the events of the day while appearing to sleep. Across from her, Liana had actually dozed off, her steady breathing the only sound in the confined space. The subtle click of the door lock jolted Maya to full alertness. Her eyes remained closed, but every muscle in her body tensed, ready to move. The door creaked open slowly, and heavy footsteps entered the cell. Maya could sense the presence of more than one person. A shadow fell across her face. The air shifted with movement, carrying the faint scent of leather and sweat. Maya's training kicked in. Two assailants, both male based on their breathing patterns and footfall. One was larger, positioned near the door. The other stood directly over her. You should have just taken the sentence, a voice hissed, muffled slightly by what Maya guessed was a mask. Maya's eyes snapped open just as the closer attacker reached for her. In one fluid motion, she rolled off the bunk, her FBI combat training taking over. The man's hand grabbed empty air where she had been lying a split second before. Liana was already moving, having awakened at the first sound of the lock. Despite their shackled hands, both sisters had positioned themselves with their backs to the wall, facing their attackers. The larger man lunged at Liana, throwing a wild punch that she easily dodged. Her movement was restricted by the chains, but years of training had taught her to work with limited mobility. She ducked under his arm, using his momentum against him to drive her shoulder into his solar plexus. Maya faced the first attacker, who had recovered from his initial surprise. He came at her with more caution now, trying to use his superior reach. Maya waited until he committed to a grabbing motion, then stepped inside his guard. Her shackled hands moved as one unit, striking upward in a sharp arc that caught him under the chin. His head snapped back, and she followed through with a sweep of his legs. The confined space of the cell worked to the sisters' advantage. The attackers couldn't maneuver properly, their size becoming a hindrance rather than an asset. Maya's opponent hit the ground hard, his mask sliding slightly to reveal pale skin beneath. Liana continued to grapple with the larger man, who had managed to pin her against the wall. She brought her knee up sharply, connecting with his groin. He doubled over, and she used the chain between her wrists like a garrote, wrapping it around his neck and pulling tight. The first attacker scrambled to his feet, reaching into his jacket. The glint of steel caught Maya's eye, a knife. Her heart rate spiked, but her expression remained calm. She had been trained for this. Before the man could bring the blade to bear, heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. A guard appeared in the doorway, his hand already on his weapon. "FBI, drop it." The knife clattered to the floor. Both attackers bolted for the door, shoving past the guard. Their footsteps echoed down the corridor as they fled. Within minutes, the cell block was swarming with FBI agents. Maya and Liana sat on the lower bunk while medics checked them for injuries. The sisters were scraped and bruised, but otherwise unharmed. "You okay?" Maya asked, studying her twin's face. Liana nodded, a grim smile playing at her lips. They weren't expecting us to fight back. Agent Thompson, their lead handler, entered the cell with a tablet in his hands. "Security footage is already being analyzed," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We got clear shots of them entering the building. They used fake guard credentials, but the IDs can be traced." He turned the tablet to show them a freeze frame from the surveillance video. The image showed the two men in the corridor, their masks clearly visible. Facial recognition picked up partial matches from the way their masks sat. "We're running them through our database now." Another agent stepped into the already crowded cell, speaking in low tones to Thompson. "Sir, we've got a hit on their vehicle. It's registered to a security company with known connections to Judge Harris's brother-in-law." Thompson's expression hardened. "Get me everything on that company. Bank records, employee files, phone logs, everything." He turned back to Maya and Liana. "You two are being moved to a secure location immediately. This just became an attempted murder investigation." As they were led out of the cell, Maya could hear snippets of conversation from the FBI team working the scene. Evidence technicians photographed the knife, while others dusted for prints on the door and walls. In a makeshift command center down the hall, agents huddled around monitors displaying security footage from multiple angles. They tracked the attacker's entrance and exit, noting timestamps and identifying potential witnesses. "Run that back," one agent said, pointing to a screen. "There, that guard let them in through the service entrance. He's got to be on Harris's payroll." Another agent was on the phone, his voice tight with urgency. "I need those phone records now. Yes, all calls to and from Judge Harris's office for the past week, and get me his brother-in-law's cell records too." Thompson stood in the center of the activity, directing the investigation with calm efficiency. An agent approached him with a preliminary report. "Sir, the security company has done work for Harris before. They've been paid through a series of shell corporations, but we're following the money trail." As the evidence mounted, one of the younger agents shook his head in disbelief. "He just made his biggest mistake," he muttered, watching the security footage replay on the screen. The team turned to their lead investigator, Agent Thompson, who was already reaching for his phone. "Let's end this," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the room. The next day, the morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Maya and Liana walked into the courtroom with measured steps, their orange jumpsuits a stark contrast against the dark wood paneling. The bruises from last night's attack were clearly visible on their arms, purple marks that told a silent story of violence and desperation. Beneath the fabric, more bruises bloomed across their ribs and backs, hidden testimonies to what they had endured. The gallery filled quickly, the room buzzing with whispers as people noticed the sisters' injuries. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, their eyes darting between the twins and Judge Harris, who sat at his bench pretending to review documents. Several journalists leaned forward in their seats, hungry for the story unfolding before them, while concerned citizens exchanged troubled glances. Harris looked up briefly, his face a mask of indifference. But Maya caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped his pen just a bit harder when he saw them still standing tall. His carefully constructed facade was beginning to show cracks. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the courtroom. "All rise," the bailiff called out, though Harris was already seated, a small breach of protocol that didn't go unnoticed by the more experienced courtroom observers. The sister's attorney stood, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit new evidence that has come to light following an incident last night." His voice carried confidence that seemed to fill the entire room. Harris waved his hand dismissively. "Proceed," he said, his voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't quite mask his tension. He shifted in his seat, the leather chair creaking under his weight. The attorney nodded to a technician who wheeled in a large screen. "What the court is about to see is security footage from the county jail, taken approximately at 11:45 p.m. last night." He stood with perfect posture, his gaze steady and unwavering. The lights dimmed and the video began to play. The footage was crystal clear, showing two masked men entering through a service door, being waved through by a guard who barely glanced at their credentials. The timestamp moved forward, tracking their movement through the facility until they reached the sister's cell. Every person in the courtroom leaned forward, captivated by the damning images unfolding before them. "If you'll notice," the attorney continued, "these individuals gained access using security passes linked to Elite Guardian Services, a company that has received substantial payments from several shell corporations connected to Judge Harris's brother-in-law Marcus Whitman." He pointed to specific details on the screen, making sure no one missed the crucial evidence. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Harris's face remained stone still, but a vein pulsed visibly in his temple. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench. "Furthermore," the attorney pressed on, "phone records show multiple calls between Elite Guardian Services and numbers registered to both Mr. Whitman and Judge Harris's chambers in the hours preceding the attack." He produced a stack of papers, holding them up for all to see. The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection! This is pure speculation." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his own uncertainty. "Overruled," Harris snapped, then seemed to catch himself, adding more calmly, "But the defense should be aware that correlation doesn't imply causation." He tugged at his collar, which suddenly seemed too tight around his neck. The attorney smiled slightly. "Perhaps this next piece of evidence will help establish causation, Your Honor." He gestured again to the technician, who switched to a different video feed. His confidence was palpable, spreading through the courtroom like electricity. This footage showed the aftermath of the attack, FBI agents processing the scene, photographing a knife that lay on the cell floor. The camera zoomed in on the handle, revealing a small logo, Elite Guardian Services. The image was unmistakable, the connection impossible to deny. The gallery burst into chaos, reporters rushed for the doors, eager to phone in their stories. Citizens in the gallery stood up, pointing and shouting at Harris. The prosecutor's face had gone pale, and he was frantically whispering to his assistant. Papers flew as people moved about, the sounds of gasps and exclamations filling the air. "Order!" Harris shouted, his face flushing red as he slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order in this court!" But his voice cracked slightly, betraying his rising panic. Beads of sweat now ran freely down his temples, his composure dissolving with each passing second. The attorney wasn't finished. "We have also obtained security footage from Elite Guardian Services office showing Mr. Whitman entering the building yesterday afternoon, just hours before the attack." He stood tall, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Harris's composure finally shattered. He stood up abruptly, his robe swishing around him. "This is preposterous," he bellowed, his face now a deep crimson. "I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus based on circumstantial evidence and wild accusations." Spittle flew from his mouth as he shouted, his normally perfect appearance completely undone. But no one was listening anymore. The gallery had devolved into complete chaos, with people shouting and pointing at the judge. Reporters were live streaming on their phones, capturing every moment of Harris's meltdown. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning, documenting his fall from grace. "Silence!" Harris roared, slamming his gavel so hard the head broke off, clattering across the bench. The sound echoed through the courtroom, but instead of quieting the crowd, it only seemed to fuel their frenzy. The wooden head rolled to the edge of the bench and fell to the floor with a symbolic thud. Maya watched as Harris's carefully constructed world crumbled around him. His hands shook as he tried to maintain order, his voice growing hoarse from shouting. The man who had lorded over this courtroom for decades was losing control, and everyone could see it. His power, once absolute in this room, evaporated like morning dew under the harsh sun of truth. Across the room, FBI agents stood against the walls, their faces impassive but their eyes alert, watching every move. They had positioned themselves strategically, 2 by each exit, one near the bench, another close to the sisters. Their hands rested near their weapons, ready for whatever might happen next. Maya leaned slightly toward Liana, her eyes never leaving Harris's increasingly erratic movements. "He's breaking," she whispered, keeping her voice low enough that only her sister could hear. A hint of satisfaction flickered across her face. Liana gave an almost imperceptible nod, watching as Harris's defense team huddled together, frantically passing notes and whispering among themselves. "He won't last much longer," she responded quietly, observing the complete dissolution of the judge's authority and composure. For the first time since their ordeal began, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. The evening sky darkened over Judge Edward Harris's mansion, casting long shadows across his manicured lawn. Inside, he paced his study like a caged animal, his perfectly polished shoes wearing a path in the expensive Persian rug. The ice in his crystal tumbler clinked as his trembling hands brought the glass to his lips, spilling drops of aged scotch onto his silk tie. The events of the day played over and over in his mind. The damning evidence, the shocked faces in the courtroom, the complete loss of control he'd maintained for decades. His temple throbbed with each replay of the security footage, each remembered whisper from the gallery, each flash of those twins' knowing looks. His phone buzzed against the mahogany desk, the screen lighting up with his lawyer's name. Harris stared at it, letting it ring 3 times before finally answering. "What?" he snapped, his voice hoarse from the day's shouting. "Edward." His lawyer's voice was firm but carried an edge of resignation he'd never heard before. "I've reviewed everything, the evidence, the recordings, the witness statements." He paused, exhaling heavily. "It's over, they have everything." Harris gripped the phone tighter. There must be something. "There isn't," his lawyer cut him off. "The FBI has been building this case for months. Those girls? They're federal agents. This whole thing was a sting operation, and we walked right into it." The crystal tumbler slipped from Harris's hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. He barely noticed. "You need to surrender," his lawyer continued. "If you cooperate now, we might be able to—" "No," Harris interrupted, his voice rising. "No, there's still a way out." He looked around his study wildly, eyes landing on the family portrait above his fireplace. Him standing proud in his judge's robes, the perfect image of authority and control. "Edward, listen to me." Harris ended the call, tossing the phone onto his desk. His heart raced as he moved with sudden purpose, yanking open his desk drawer and pulling out his passport. He rushed to his bedroom, pulling a leather suitcase from his closet and throwing it onto the bed. His hand shook as he stuffed clothes inside. Expensive suits, silk ties, anything he could grab. In the bathroom, he swept his toiletries into a bag, not caring that his imported cologne leaked onto his monogrammed towels. Think, he muttered to himself as he packed. His vacation house in the Cayman Islands, they couldn't touch him there. He had money stored away, connections who could help him disappear. All he needed was to get out before. Red and blue lights suddenly flooded his bedroom, strobing across the walls like a nightmare come to life. Harris froze, one hand still clutching a handful of ties. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the quiet neighborhood, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. "Edward Harris," a voice boomed through a megaphone, clear and authoritative. "This is the FBI. Come out with your hands up." The ties slipped from his grasp, falling silently onto the plush carpet. His breath caught in his throat as he moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. FBI vehicles surrounded his house, agents taking position behind their cars with weapons drawn. The lights continued their relentless dance across his pristine white walls, turning his sanctuary into something alien and hostile. "We have the house surrounded," the voice continued. "Come out slowly with your hands where we can see them." Harris stumbled back from the window, his legs giving out as he sank onto the edge of his bed. The half-packed suitcase mocked him with its promise of escape. His chest tightened as reality crashed down around him. There would be no escape, no clever legal maneuver, no powerful friends coming to his rescue. In one of the unmarked cars parked across the street, Maya and Liana Carter watched intently. The sisters sat in silence as Harris's front door slowly opened, spilling warm light onto his front steps. The man who emerged barely resembled the imperious judge who had terrorized their courtroom just hours ago. Harris stepped out with his hands raised above his head, his usually immaculate appearance now disheveled. His tie hung loose around his neck, his silver hair unkempt. The red and blue lights caught the sweat on his face as he moved forward with unsteady steps. "On your knees," an agent commanded. Harris complied, lowering himself slowly onto his own front walk. As agents approached to handcuff him, his head turned toward the unmarked car. For the first time since this began, his eyes met Maya and Liana's directly. There was no trace of his former arrogance, no hint of the man who had sneered at them from his bench. All that remained was defeat, pure and absolute. The sisters watched as agents secured his wrists behind his back, reciting his rights with practiced efficiency. Maya leaned back in her seat, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "That's checkmate." Days later, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. A sea of reporters and spectators packed shoulder to shoulder on the wooden benches. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning strikes, each photographer desperate to capture the historic moment. The air felt electric, charged with the weight of justice finally being served. Maya and Liana Carter sat at the prosecution table, their professional attire a stark contrast to the orange jumpsuits they'd worn just weeks ago. They exchanged quiet glances as they arranged their notes, their movements precise and controlled. The FBI's legal team surrounded them, a fortress of dark suits and determined expressions. The door to the holding area creaked open, drawing every eye in the room. Edward Harris shuffled in, his hands and feet bound in chains that clinked with each hesitant step. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame, as if he'd deflated since his arrest. The man who once commanded the courtroom with arrogant authority now kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his circumstances. The bailiff guided Harris to his seat at the defense table. The former judge's face was ashen, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. His usual self-assured smirk had vanished, replaced by tight, downturned lips and deeply etched worry lines. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Patricia Thompson entered, her black robes flowing as she took her place at the bench. The irony of a black woman presiding over Harris's case wasn't lost on anyone in the room. She surveyed the courtroom with steady eyes, her presence commanding immediate respect. "Be seated," she said, her voice clear and firm. "We're here today for the United States versus Edward Harris." She looked directly at the former judge. "Mr. Harris, you stand accused of multiple counts of judicial misconduct, corruption, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. How do you plead?" Harris's lawyer stood. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The lead prosecutor rose from beside Maya and Liana, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to present its first piece of evidence." He nodded to an FBI technician, who wheeled in an audio system. The courtroom fell silent as the first recording began to play. Harris's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. "Make sure those files disappear. We can't have anyone looking too closely at those sentencing patterns." Another voice responded, "What about the statistical analysis?" "Doctor the numbers," Harris's recorded voice said. "No one questions a judge's decisions. Just make it look clean." Maya watched Harris's face as the recordings played. His jaw clenched tighter with each damning word, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Liana noticed a slight tremor in his left hand, the same one that used to hold his gavel with such authority. The prosecution called their star witness next. The former court clerk, James Mitchell, took the stand. His hands fidgeted with his tie as he was sworn in. "Mr. Mitchell," the prosecutor began, "how long did you work under Judge Harris?" 12 years, Mitchell replied, his voice shaky but clear. "And during that time, what instructions did Judge Harris give you regarding case documentation?" Mitchell swallowed hard. He had a system. Cases involving white defendants were marked with a small dot on the corner of the file. Those files would go into his priority stack. Mitchell's eyes darted to Harris before continuing. He made sure those cases got lighter sentences, better plea deals. But cases with black defendants... He paused, taking a deep breath. Those were rushed through. Maximum sentences. No leniency. The defense attorney jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculation about Judge Harris's internal decision-making process." "Overruled," Judge Thompson stated firmly. "Continue, Mr. Mitchell." "We kept 2 sets of statistics," Mitchell went on. "One for the public record and one showing the real numbers. When anyone requested sentencing data, I was told to provide the altered version." The prosecutor displayed a series of spreadsheets on the courtroom screens. "Are these the documents you're referring to, Mr. Mitchell?" "Yes," he nodded. "The highlighted sections show where we changed the numbers to hide the disparities." Harris's defense team huddled together, whispering frantically. One of them stood, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, my client was simply following standard procedures for case management. These administrative decisions were well within his discretion as a judge." Judge Thompson's eyebrow raised slightly. "Are you suggesting that maintaining false records and deliberately manipulating sentencing data is standard procedure, Counselor?" The defense attorney faltered. "No, Your Honor. I merely mean to say that the organization of cases and prioritization of the docket falls under judicial discretion." "Then perhaps you can explain the recorded phone calls discussing the deliberate destruction of evidence," the prosecutor interjected. The morning continued with a parade of witnesses. Former defendants who had faced Harris's biased rulings, court staff who had observed his discrimination firsthand, and FBI analysts who had tracked his pattern of judicial misconduct over decades. Maya and Liana sat straight-backed through it all, their expressions professional but their eyes intense. They watched as Harris seemed to shrink further into himself with each new testimony, each piece of evidence, each damning revelation. By late afternoon, the weight of the prosecution's case hung heavy in the air. The defense team's arguments grew increasingly desperate, trying to paint Harris's actions as mere procedural choices rather than the systematic discrimination they clearly were. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Judge Thompson called for recess until the following morning. Harris was led back to his holding cell, the chains around his ankles scraping against the floor. His lawyer followed him to the cell, waiting until the guard stepped away before speaking. His voice was low and serious, all pretense of confidence gone. "You have 2 choices," he said, watching his client slump onto the narrow bed. "Take a plea deal, or spend the rest of your life in prison." Harris didn't respond. He sat motionless, staring at the concrete floor, the same floor other defendants had stared at while awaiting his judgment. The former judge remained silent, the echo of his own gavel seeming to ring in his ears. The fluorescent lights in the holding cell buzzed overhead as Harris paced back and forth, his expensive shoes scuffing against the concrete floor. His mind raced with possibilities, refusing to accept that his career, his life, could end like this. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight when a guard approached his cell. "Your lawyer's here," the guard announced, his keys jingling as he unlocked the door. Harris's attorney slipped into the cell carrying a slim leather briefcase. His face was tight with urgency. "I have a message," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder before pulling out a folded note. Harris's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. The message was brief, written in familiar handwriting he recognized from years of backroom deals. "We can still get you out of this, deny everything, and put the blame on the system." His heart quickened. The note was from Senator Richardson, one of the most powerful figures in state politics. A man who owed Harris several favors, and who had just as much to lose if certain cases were re-examined. He says public opinion is still malleable, the lawyer continued in hushed tones. The media's hungry for a different angle. We can spin this as a witch hunt, claim you're being targeted for political reasons. Harris straightened his shoulders, feeling a spark of his old confidence return. Get me a press statement ready for tomorrow, he ordered. We're changing our strategy. The next morning, the courtroom hummed with tension as Harris strode in, his chin lifted with renewed defiance. Maya and Liana sat with the FBI team, watching him carefully. The change in his demeanor was obvious. Gone was the defeated man from yesterday, replaced by something more dangerous, a cornered animal ready to fight. Judge Thompson called the court to order. Mr. Harris, I understand you wish to change your plea? Harris's lawyer stood. Yes, Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, his voice growing stronger, we move to dismiss all charges on the grounds that this entire case represents a politically motivated attack on the judiciary itself. He pulled out a thick stack of documents. What we have here is not corruption, but standard operating procedure in our courts. Every judge makes similar decisions based on their experience and judgment. My client is being singled out and scapegoated for political gain. The defense team launched into a carefully orchestrated presentation. They showed statistics from other courts, highlighting similar sentencing patterns. They brought forward legal experts who spoke about judicial discretion and the complexity of the system. This is not about one judge, Harris's lawyer argued, gesturing broadly. This is about attacking the entire judicial system for political points. My client simply followed established practices. If we're going to put him on trial, we might as well put every judge in this state on trial. Maya leaned forward in her seat, her fingers digging into her notepad. He's trying to manipulate public opinion, she whispered to Liana, watching as several reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Liana exhaled slowly, her jaw tight. We need something stronger, she murmured back. He's making this about the system instead of his actions. The defense's presentation continued, painting Harris as a dedicated public servant caught in a political crossfire. They showed clips of his public service awards, testimonials from prominent community members, and carefully selected cases where he had shown leniency to minority defendants. This is a witch hunt, Harris's lawyer declared, his voice echoing through the courtroom. An attempt to destroy a man's reputation for doing exactly what every other judge does. We demand these charges be dismissed. The prosecution team exchanged worried glances as several media outlets began live-streaming the proceedings. The narrative was shifting, exactly as Harris and his powerful allies had planned. During the lunch recess, Maya and Liana huddled with the FBI team in a secure conference room. The lead agent paced back and forth, his tie loosened in frustration. He's playing to the cameras, one agent growled, and some people are buying it. The public loves a conspiracy theory, another added, scrolling through social media reactions. Look at these headlines already. Judge claims political persecution. System on trial. Harris fights back. The twins watched the mounting tension in the room. They had come too far to let Harris slip away now, to let him twist the truth and paint himself as a victim. That evening, after court adjourned, the FBI team gathered in their operations center. Maps, photos, and timelines covered the walls, evidence of months of careful investigation. The supervisor stood at the head of the table, his face grave. If he wants to fight dirty, the supervisor said, looking around at his team, then we bring out the final piece of evidence. Maya and Liana exchanged knowing looks. They had been holding back their strongest card, waiting for the right moment. Now, with Harris trying to manipulate the narrative, that moment had arrived. The team huddled together, reviewing files and preparing for tomorrow's counterattack. Outside, news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the night sky, broadcasting Harris's claims of persecution to the world. But inside, in the quiet focus of the operations center, the FBI team knew the truth was about to change everything. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the packed gallery. Harris sat at the defense table, his posture rigid and confident after yesterday's media offensive. His expensive suit seemed to shine under the fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the orange jumpsuit he'd worn in his holding cell. Maya and Liana watched from their seats beside the FBI team, their faces carefully neutral despite the tension crackling through the air. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras ready, expecting another day of Harris's claims about political persecution. Judge Thompson called the court to order, her gavel echoing through the hushed room. The lead prosecutor rose slowly from his chair, straightening his tie. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and steady, "the prosecution has one last witness." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as Judge Marcus Reynolds entered. His silver hair and distinguished bearing commanded immediate attention, but it was his presence itself that caused Harris to suddenly stiffen in his chair. Reynolds had served alongside Harris for 15 years before retiring 2 years ago. They had been more than colleagues. They had been friends, confidants, members of the same exclusive country club. Harris's face drained of color as Reynolds made his way to the witness stand. The clerk administered the oath, Reynolds' hand steady on the Bible as he swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor approached the stand, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. "Judge Reynolds, how long did you work with the defendant?" 15 years, 3 months, and 14 days, Reynolds replied, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "And during that time, what patterns did you observe in Judge Harris's sentencing decisions?" Reynolds took a deep breath, his eyes briefly meeting Harris's before looking away. "It was systematic," he began. "Edward, Judge Harris didn't just show occasional bias. He actively worked to ensure Black defendants received maximum sentences, particularly in cases where private prisons stood to benefit." The prosecutor nodded. "Could you be more specific?" "He would find any reason to deny bail for Black defendants, forcing them to stay in private facilities while awaiting trial. He would reject plea deals that the prosecution offered them, pushing for trials he knew would result in longer sentences. He had a saying." Reynolds paused, swallowing hard. He called it, "keeping the beds warm." A low murmur swept through the courtroom. Harris's attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection! This is hearsay." "Your Honor," the prosecutor countered, "Judge Reynolds is testifying to direct conversations with the defendant." "Overruled," Judge Thompson stated firmly. "Continue." Reynolds shifted in his seat. "There's more. While he was ensuring maximum sentences for Black defendants, he was simultaneously dismissing cases against white criminals, including violent offenders." The prosecutor walked to his table and picked up a manila folder. "Could you tell us about the Thompson case?" "That was a turning point for me," Reynolds said, his voice heavy with regret. "A white businessman had assaulted 3 Black employees. Clear evidence, multiple witnesses. Harris dismissed it, claiming insufficient evidence. The next week I saw him golfing with the defendant's father." Harris's face had turned an alarming shade of red. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table, knuckles white. The prosecutor nodded to an FBI technician. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to play Exhibit 47. A recording crackled through the courtroom speakers. Harris's voice, slightly slurred as if he'd been drinking, filled the room. "Those people need to learn their place. Every year I keep them locked up is another year our friends at Riverside Private Corrections can count on their investment. It's a win-win." The recording continued, Harris's voice growing more animated. "Did you see the look on that kid's face yesterday when I denied his appeal? 15 years for a first offense. That's how you keep the streets clean. That's how you keep those people where they belong." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. Several jurors visibly recoiled. Maya pressed her lips together, while Liana's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. That's doctored," Harris suddenly shouted, jumping to his feet. "This is a setup. They're trying to destroy me." His face was contorted with rage, spittle flying from his lips. "You can't do this to me. I've served this community for 30 years. "Order!" Judge Thompson's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Mr. Harris, sit down or you will be held in contempt." Harris remained standing, his chest heaving. "This is what they do," he continued ranting, gesturing wildly at Maya and Liana. "They come in here. They play the victim. They destroy good people. Remove the defendant until he can control himself. Judge Thompson ordered. Two bailiffs moved forward, but Harris jerked away from their grasp. "You don't understand," he shouted. "Someone has to keep them in line. Someone has to maintain order. I was doing this city a favor." The bailiffs finally managed to restrain him, but Harris continued shouting as they led him from the courtroom. His words echoed off the walls, each outburst another nail in his coffin. After order was restored, the jury was dismissed to begin deliberations. They returned in less than 2 hours, a clear sign of their decision. The jury foreman stood, holding a single sheet of paper. The courtroom held its collective breath. In the matter of the state versus Edward Harris on the charge of judicial misconduct, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of corruption, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman continued reading through all 18 counts. Guilty. 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 Harris slumped in his chair, all his previous bluster gone. His face had taken on an ashen quality, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. Maya and Liana exchanged a glance across the courtroom. No words were needed. After months of undercover work, after putting their lives on the line, after enduring Harris's mockery and threats, it was finally over. The morning of Harris's sentencing arrived with a heavy silence blanketing the courthouse. The same courtroom that had witnessed his downfall now prepared for his final judgment. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches filled with spectators, reporters, and victims of Harris's corrupt reign. Maya and Liana sat in the front row, their postures straight and professional in their dark suits. They watched as Harris shuffled into the courtroom, his expensive tailoring replaced by a plain orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. The past few weeks in detention had taken their toll. His face was gaunt, his silver hair unkempt, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his crimes. Judge Thompson sat at her bench, her dark robes a stark reminder of the power Harris had once wielded and abused. Her expression remained neutral as she reviewed the papers before her, but her eyes held a steely determination. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "please rise for your sentencing." Harris stood slowly, his chains rattling in the silence. His attorney rose beside him, a hand on his elbow as if to steady him. The once mighty judge could barely lift his eyes from the floor. "Before I deliver your sentence, you have the right to make a final statement," Judge Thompson continued. "Do you wish to address the court?" Harris's mouth worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. When he spoke, it was barely above a whisper, a far cry from his previous commanding presence. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, his words falling flat in the quiet room. Judge Thompson leaned forward, her expression hardening. "Your job, Mr. Harris, was to uphold justice. Instead, you corrupted it. You twisted the law to serve your own prejudices and profit from the suffering of others. You betrayed not only your oath but the very foundation of our legal system." She paused, letting her words sink in. Harris seemed to shrink further into himself. "The evidence presented in this case revealed a pattern of systematic racism and corruption spanning decades," she continued. "You used your position of power to destroy lives, to tear families apart, and to perpetuate a cycle of injustice that has plagued our justice system for far too long." The judge lifted a document from her bench. "I have here impact statements from just a fraction of the people whose lives you damaged. Fathers who missed their children growing up, students who lost their chance at education, families who lost their homes and savings fighting your rigged system." Harris swayed slightly on his feet. His attorney gripped his arm tighter. "Edward Harris, this court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole." Judge Thompson's voice rang with finality. "Furthermore, you are permanently disbarred and will pay restitution to your victims in an amount to be determined in civil proceedings." The courtroom erupted. Some people jumped to their feet, cheering. Others remained seated, tears streaming down their faces as years of injustice finally found resolution. Still others sat in stunned silence, processing the weight of the moment. Maya and Liana remained still, watching as two bailiffs approached Harris. The same type of shackles he had forced countless innocent people to wear now clinked around his own wrists and ankles. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. As the bailiffs led Harris toward the side door, he passed directly in front of Maya and Liana. For a brief moment, his eyes met theirs. There was no trace of his former arrogance, no hint of the man who had mockingly dismissed them months ago. He quickly looked away, shuffling forward in his chains. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaos. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing and microphones extended. Maya and Liana emerged into the bright sunlight, flanked by their FBI colleagues. Agent Carter, the reporters called out, pressing forward. How does it feel to take down a corrupt system? Maya paused, considering her words carefully. The cameras focused on her face as she spoke. This isn't about taking down one man, she said firmly. It's about ensuring this never happens again. Judge Harris's conviction sends a message that no one is above the law, that justice must be truly blind, not selectively blind. Questions continued to fly, but the FBI team guided them through the crowd to their waiting vehicles. The sisters maintained their professional composure until they were safely inside their apartment that evening. The city lights twinkled below their balcony as Maya and Liana finally allowed themselves to relax. They sat in comfortable silence, each holding a glass of wine, taking in the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Liana looked out at the skyline, her expression thoughtful. There are more like him out there, she said quietly. Maya nodded, her eyes reflecting the distant lights. Then we go after them next. They clinked their glasses together, the soft sound carrying into the night air. The case was closed, but they both knew this was just the beginning. Days later, the fluorescent lights hummed steadily in the FBI headquarters as Maya and Liana sat in the crowded debriefing room. The walls, usually stark and professional, were now covered with photos, timelines, and documents, a visual testament to their successful operation against Judge Harris. The sisters sat side by side at the long conference table, surrounded by their fellow agents and legal team members. Special Agent Thompson, their supervisor, stood at the front of the room, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation. As of this morning, he announced, we've identified 53 cases that show clear evidence of Harris's racial bias and judicial misconduct. Each one is being fast-tracked for review. Maya studied the faces on the screen, men and women, mostly black, whose lives Harris had carelessly destroyed. Some had served decades for minor offenses, while others had been convicted on flimsy evidence that wouldn't have held up in an unbiased courtroom. The Justice Department has assigned a special task force, Thompson continued, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. They're working around the clock to process appeals and release those who were wrongfully convicted. Liana leaned forward, her pen tapping against her notepad. What about the enablers? She asked. The clerks, the prosecutors who knew what was happening? Thompson nodded, clicking to the next slide. That's where it gets interesting. This morning, a class action lawsuit was filed against the entire judicial district. It names 27 officials who either actively participated in or turned a blind eye to Harris's corruption. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as agents discussed the implications. Maya watched as Thompson pulled up another screen showing news coverage from various networks. The split in public opinion was stark and immediate. On one channel, a civil rights attorney praised the FBI's work. This is a watershed moment for justice reform. The Carter sisters have exposed what many of us have known for years, that systemic racism isn't just a phrase, it's a reality in our courtrooms. The next clip showed a former colleague of Harris red-faced and defensive. This is nothing but a witch hunt. They're trying to dismantle our entire judicial system based on one man's actions. Thompson muted the television. The media circus is just beginning, he warned. But don't let that distract you from what matters, the people we're helping. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. An agent stepped in, followed by a tall man in his 40s. Marcus Johnson walked slowly into the room, his eyes taking in the faces around him. He had spent 15 years in prison for a robbery he didn't commit, one of Harris's earliest cases. The room fell silent as Marcus made his way to the front. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the back of a chair. I wanted to come thank you all personally, he began, his voice thick with emotion. Especially you two. He looked directly at Maya and Liana. When I was convicted, Marcus continued, I kept telling everyone I was innocent. The evidence was wrong. The witnesses were lying. But Harris, he paused, swallowing hard. Harris looked at me like I was nothing, just another black man he could throw away. Tears began rolling down his cheeks. I missed my daughter growing up. My mother died while I was inside. I thought no one would ever believe me. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. But you did. You believed me. And you proved it. Maya felt her own eyes growing wet as she watched this strong man break down in front of them. Liana reached over and squeezed her sister's hand under the table. We're reviewing your civil case now, Thompson assured Marcus. The compensation won't give you back those years, but it's not about the money, Marcus interrupted, shaking his head. It's about being heard, being seen as a human being. He straightened up, composing himself. I just needed you all to know what this means. Not just to me, but to all of us who Harris hurt. After Marcus left, the debriefing continued with updates on the expanding federal investigation. 3 other judges in neighboring districts had already been arrested, their pattern of bias matching Harris's. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had initially suspected. As the meeting wrapped up, agents filed out of the room, leaving Maya and Liana gathering their notes. The sisters worked in comfortable silence, both processing the emotional weight of Marcus's visit. Finally, Maya looked up from her papers. We fought for them, she said quietly, but there are so many more. Liana nodded, a familiar fire lighting up her eyes. This was just the beginning. The federal prison library was quiet except for the soft rustling of pages and the occasional cough. Edward Harris sat alone at a corner table, his prison uniform hanging loosely on his now thin frame. His once commanding presence had diminished, replaced by a hunched posture and tired eyes that moved slowly across the pages of The New Jim Crow in front of him. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on his face, highlighting the new wrinkles that had formed during his year behind bars. His silver hair, previously perfectly styled, now hung limply around his face. His hands, once steady while wielding a gavel, trembled slightly as he turned each page. Never thought I'd see you reading that, a voice interrupted his concentration. Harris looked up to see Marcus Williams, another inmate serving time for tax fraud, standing over his table. Harris didn't immediately respond. He marked his place in the book with a worn piece of paper and closed it carefully. Neither did I, he admitted, his voice lacking its former authority. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat down, studying the former judge with curiosity. So why are you... Harris ran his fingers over the book's cover, tracing the letters. Because I finally understand, he muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. The words seemed to cost him something to say, as if each syllable carried the weight of his past decisions. Understand what? Marcus pressed, leaning forward. Harris looked up, his eyes reflecting a pain that hadn't been there during his time on the bench. Everything I refused to see before, everything I was taught not to see. Meanwhile, across the city, the FBI headquarters buzzed with excitement. The grand ballroom had been transformed for the annual awards ceremony, with American flags flanking the stage and rows of chairs filled with agents in their finest attire. Maya and Liana Carter sat in the front row, both wearing their formal FBI blazers. They listened as the director spoke about their achievement in bringing down Judge Harris and the subsequent domino effect it had on exposing judicial corruption across the state. The Carter sisters exemplify the very best of the Bureau, the director announced, his voice booming through the speakers. Their dedication to justice, regardless of personal risk, has helped restore faith in our judicial system. As applause filled the room, Maya and Liana exchanged a knowing look. While others saw this as a moment of triumph, they were already focused on their next assignment, a sprawling investigation into state-level corruption that made the Harris case look simple in comparison. After receiving their commendations, they moved through the crowd of well-wishers, accepting congratulations with polite smiles. An agent approached them, holding an envelope. "This came for you," he said, handing it to Maya. "It's been through security screening." Maya turned the envelope over, recognizing the prison mailing address. Her expression remained neutral, but Liana noticed her sister's slight tension. "It's from him, isn't it?" Liana asked quietly. Maya nodded, slipping the envelope into her jacket pocket. Neither sister needed to say Harris's name. They could feel the weight of his presence even in that simple envelope. The ceremony continued around them, but their minds were elsewhere. They made their excuses early, leaving the celebration behind for the quiet of their apartment. The city lights twinkled below their balcony as Maya and Liana settled into their usual chairs. The familiar sounds of traffic drifted up from the streets, creating a gentle backdrop to this moment of truth. Maya finally pulled out the envelope, studying it in the soft evening light. With careful movements, she opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was different from Harris's usual confident scrawl, more hesitant, more human. The sisters read in silence, "Dear Maya and Liana Carter, I've written this letter 100 times in my head over the past year. Each version seemed inadequate, unable to convey what I need to say. But I'll try again. I was wrong." Those 3 words seem so simple, yet they've taken me a lifetime to understand. I was raised in a world of privilege and prejudice, where certain truths were never questioned. My father was a judge, his father before him. They taught me that justice meant maintaining order, their order. I never questioned why all my family's friends looked like us, talked like us, lived like us. I never questioned why the defendants in my courtroom who didn't look like us always seemed to get longer sentences. I told myself I was being fair, objective, following the law. But I wasn't following the law. I was following the path of least resistance, perpetuating a system that destroyed lives. Your investigation didn't just expose my corruption. It forced me to see myself clearly for the first time. I know these words can't undo the damage I've caused. They can't give back the years I stole from innocent people. They can't erase the pain I inflicted on countless families. My actions were unforgivable, and I don't seek forgiveness. What I do hope is that my testimony will help prevent others from following my path. Perhaps by exposing how deeply rooted these prejudices can be, how they can hide behind respectability and tradition, we can stop others from rising to positions of power with these same blind spots. The work you do matters. Don't stop with me. Sincerely, Edward Harris. Maya folded the letter carefully, her movements deliberate and measured. The city continued to pulse below them, unaware of this small moment of reckoning. "Change is slow," Maya finally said, breaking the silence. "But it's happening." Liana smirked, picking up her glass. One case at a time. They clinked their glasses together just like before, as the city lights continued to twinkle beneath them. If you enjoyed the story of these brave sisters, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. If you enjoyed the story of these brave sisters, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.